Howdy folks, and welcome back to part 3 of my visit to the United States Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Today we're going to be looking around the Cold War and Korean War exhibits. And what better place to start than America's first operational jet fighter, the PAE Shooting Star. This first flew on the 8th of January 1944. It did actually see service, although it didn't see combat in World War II. Early British and German jet fighters had two engines mounted externally in pods on the wings. This was purely because of the relatively low power of early turbojet engines. With the advent of more powerful British jet engines, the PAE Shooting Star was the first operational jet fighter to have the engine mounted in the fuselage. However, it still had straight wings. This thing was designed before the Allies had the benefit of looking over captured Luftwaffe design documents from the end of Second World War, which showed the benefits of having swept wings on jet aircraft. This reduced the onset of compressibility problems and allowed the aircraft to handle much better at higher speeds. Interestingly, you'll note that the early Russian jet fighters, the MiG-15, the MiG-17, all had swept wings. First Russian jets were obviously designed with the benefit of the knowledge gained from capturing the Luftwaffe's design documents at the end of the Second World War. But for now, British and American jets still had straight wings. As well as being the first production jet fighter aircraft to feature the engine in the fuselage, the Shooting Star was also the first American aircraft to exceed 500 miles per hour in level flight. It was the first US Air Force jet used in combat, and on the 8th of November 1950, an F-80C, flown by First Lieutenant Russell J. Brown of the US Air Force, was the first American pilot to shoot down a Russian-built MiG-15 in the world's first all-jet fighter air battle. Due to the rapid pace of aircraft development in the 1950s, the Korean War was the first and last place that the F-80 saw major combat service. It was initially used as a fighter aircraft and as a ground attack aircraft, although it was inferior to the MiG-15. Its main opponent in the skies over Korea. Before MiG-15s were introduced into combat, the Shooting Star did claim several kills against Yak-9s and IL-10s, and they even managed a couple of MiG-15 kills, but the aircraft was clearly inferior to its Russian opponent. Once sufficient F-86 Sabres had been introduced into the combat theatre, the Shooting Star was withdrawn from service as a fighter aircraft, although it did continue to see service in Korea right up to the end of the war as a fighter bomber in the ground attack role. The aircraft that replaced the F-80, the F-86 Sabre, was a much closer match for its main adversary, the MiG-15. Like the MiG-15, it had swept wings. On paper, the F-86 and the MiG-15 were pretty well matched. The Sabre was a little underpowered, and the MiG-15 could outclimb it. The MiG was also more heavily armed with 223 and 137mm cannon. The MiG's cannon did have a low rate of fire, but it only took a couple of hits from them to knock a Sabre out of the sky, while the Sabre's 650 caliber machine guns kind of lacked hitting power by comparison. The Soviets also regarded the MiG-15 as being a very rugged and durable aircraft, and in fact, in a number of cases, several of the kills that were credited to US Air Force pilots actually involved the MiG-15 limping back to base, landing, being repaired, and being able to fight again. The MiG was better at high altitude, the Sabre was better at low altitude. The MiG could outrun the Sabre, but the Sabre could outroll and outturn the MiG. The Sabre had better cockpit ergonomics, it had better field of view for the pilot. The pilot was better protected in the MiG. The one area where the F-86 definitely outclassed the MiG-15, however, was in its gun sight. The F-86's radar gun sight was clearly superior to the MiG's eyeball gun sight. So much so that when the Russians did eventually develop their own radar gun sight for their fighter aircraft, it was developed from a captured copy of the one in the F-86 Sabre. And while the Sabre's guns may have been of relatively small caliber compared to those of the MiG, they were accurate, well focused, and had a very high rate of fire. The close balance between the F-86 and the MiG-15 meant that, in a lot of cases, the critical factor in any air battle between the two was down to pilot training and skill. The legendary Chuck Yeager once took on another pilot of less skill, first flying the MiG against the Sabre, then flying the Sabre against the MiG, and beat him both times. There were a lot of very skilled Russian pilots, but the Russians were hampered in that they chose to rotate entire units in and out of combat, so that new units arriving had to learn all over again from the start, whereas the Americans, by comparison, rotated individual pilots rather than entire new squadrons, which allowed the new pilots arriving in theatre to learn the ropes from the old boys who'd already been in service in Korea. The Chinese and North Korean pilots, however, were absolutely no match for the Americans. They had very little flight experience, and the Soviet pilots who worked with them thought that many of them were actually suffering from malnutrition. Some American pilots reported MiG pilots ejecting rather than face combat, which doesn't sound too believable, but becomes a lot more believable if you accept that the pilots were barely able to even fly a MiG, much less take it into combat. By the time North American aviation were producing the definitive version, the F-86F of the Sabre, this aircraft had been honed to perfection. It was practically impossible to put the thing into a spin, and if you did by some miracle manage to spin the Sabre, then you could return it to normal flight just by neutralising the controls. Once the US Air Force got the new and the better F-86F into the skies over Korea, they decided to demonstrate the superiority of the Sabre once and for all, and in the summer of 1953 they had a turkey shoot against communist pilots that proved once and for all who was the boss. The final tally for the entire war was estimated by the US Air Force as 800 MiGs lost to Sabres, with 80 Sabres lost to MiGs, a 10-to-1 kill ratio. 30 other Sabres were lost in combat, 114 more were lost to accidents. Even assuming that the MiG losses were exaggerated by a factor of 2, that still made the Sabre the clear winner in the contest. But it was pilot training that gave the Americans the edge. Of the 40 American aces in Korea, 39 flew the F-86. Many of them had extensive World War II experience, and these 39 men were responsible for over 300 of the 800 MiG-15s claimed destroyed. US Air Force pilots certainly loved flying their Sabres, or they did if they weren't flying the F-86D, the interceptor variant of the Sabre, known, not affectionately by its pilots, as the Sabre Dog. Easily distinguishable by the bulbous nose radome and the drop-down rocket pod in the belly. The F-86D had no guns. It was an interceptor designed to go after Soviet bombers, and it would take the bombers down by firing unguided rockets at bomber formations. At the time, all radar-equipped aircraft were at least two-seaters because it took a lot of work to operate all of the electronics. The F-86D was a single-seater. The pilot had to do it all. The pilot workload on this aircraft was so great that it took longer to train an F-86D pilot to successfully fly this plane than it did to train the pilot of a B-47 bomber. Another interceptor tasked to hunt down and destroy Soviet bomber formations was the Lockheed F94 Starfire, developed from the T-33 trainer, which itself was developed from the Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star. This was the first US Air Force fighter jet to feature an afterburner. Another contemporary of the Starfire was the Republic F-84 Thunderjet, again, straight wing configuration, although there were later versions of the Thunderjet known as the Thunderstreak, which finally incorporated the whole swept-back wing design. The F-84 did see combat service in the Korean War, initially like the F-80 used as a fighter, and was credited with 8 confirmed kills of MiG-15s. However, as soon as Russian pilots started replacing the less experienced Chinese or North Korean pilots, the F-84's limitations became obvious, and it was withdrawn into the ground attack role for the remainder of the war. Speaking of the ground attack role, it's the B-26C. Or is it the A-26 Invader? Well, technically it's both, and this has led to everlasting confusion between the Martin B-26 Marauder and the Douglas A-26 Invader because they both use the designation B-26 after the B-26 Marauder was withdrawn from service. This Douglas B-26 Invader was used in the interdiction and ground strike role in the Korean War. It was initially used for daytime missions, but that was when it had nothing more dangerous than Yak-9s to go up against. By the time MiG-15s were introduced, this thing was very quickly relegated to night attack missions, which is why you will see most of them painted in this black colour scheme. Shown here as part of a tactical air control party display is the North American T-6D Mosquito. This was used as a forward air control aircraft. Essentially it was used to spot ground targets from above and call in artillery and airstrikes. Sitting behind it is the B-45C Tornado, also made by North American. It was the first American 4-engine jet bomber to fly. It was the first American production jet bomber, the first jet bomber capable of carrying an atom bomb, and the first multi-jet reconnaissance aircraft to refuel in mid-air. While we're on the subject of famous bombers, they have the fuselage of a B-29 that you can actually have a walk through. It's painted to represent the B-29 Command Decision, which was part of the 28th Bomb Squadron, 19th Bomb Group B-29s. It became famous for shooting down 5 MiG-15s, unofficially making it a bomber ace. Cockpit view here, and it does always surprise people that despite the size of aircraft like the B-29 or the B-17, the interior is incredibly cramped. You can see up there the crew tunnel that the crew would have to crawl through, that tube up above me, in order to get through the bomb bay. We're actually in one of the bomb bays right now, which should be obvious by the minimal bomb load that this thing is actually carrying. The defensive gunnery system on this B-29 was actually quite revolutionary. There were 5 different sighting stations which could selectively fire the 4 remote gun turrets and, if required, the manned tail turret. One gunner could aim and fire multiple turrets against a single target. Next up, a quick look at the F-82 Twin Mustang, one of the first American aircraft that was actually able to take part in the war in Korea because it was able to operate from air bases in Japan. In fact, the first 3 North Korean aircraft to be shot down by the US Air Force in Korea were shot down by these F-82s. Moving on to something slightly bigger than an F-82 Twin Mustang is the Convair B36 Peacemaker. This thing is absolutely massive. It's all well and good having atomic bombs, but you need something that can actually deliver those to a target, and even as early as the 11th of April 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the US Army Air Corps invited proposals for an intercontinental bomber that would have a range of 16,000 miles. Development of that bomber led to the B-36 Peacemaker, a bomber that would be able to take off from bases in North America, fly across the Atlantic to Europe, drop its bombs on the target, return and land without refueling. In order to do this, it was powered by 6 Pratt & Whitney Wasp major engines, air-cooled radials with 28 cylinders consisting of 4 banks of 7 cylinders arranged in a spiral. To give it even more performance, the C version of the B-36, as you can see here, was also fitted with 4 jet engines lifted straight from the Boeing B47 Stratojet. The first operational group of B-36Bs were formed up at Carswell Air Force Base in Texas, right next to the Convair plant that produced them. The base didn't have hangars big enough to accommodate these huge bombers. To demonstrate the machine's capabilities, on the 7th of December 1948, the Air Force decided to commemorate Pearl Harbor by flying one B-36B from Carswell to Hawaii, dropping a 10,000-pound bomb load, and then coming back home non-stop and unrefueled. It took 35 hours and 30 minutes of flight time, covering 8,100 miles at an average speed of 240 miles per hour. Parked under one of the wings of the B-36 is the Canadian-designed, Canadian-built and Canadian-flown Avro CF100 Canuck. What the hell's this doing in the US Air Force Museum? Good question. Royal Canadian Air Force CF100s flew side by side with the US Air Force as part of the North American Air Defense System in order to protect continental North America against Soviet nuclear bombers flying over the North Pole. The Canuck was phased out of service as a fighter in the early 1960s, but continued to see service as an electronic warfare aircraft well into the 1970s. We saw some of its engines earlier on the B-36, which you can see in the background there, and here is the actual bomber itself, the Boeing B47 Stratojet. Designed to replace the B-29, it was smaller, could carry more or less the same bomb load, but thanks to its jet engines, was capable of flying 200 miles per hour faster. B-47s, in addition to their nuclear strike capability, were also used as strategic reconnaissance aircraft, conducting very hazardous overflights of the Soviet Union. Tucked away there, just behind the B-47, is the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger. It's the US Air Force's first Delta Wing fighter aircraft. It was also the world's first supersonic all-weather jet interceptor, and like the CF100 Canuck, its mission was to intercept Soviet bombers. This one, as part of the 57th Fighter Interceptor Wing, operated from air bases in Reykjavik in Iceland. The next aircraft on display is probably going to be instantly recognisable, the F-104 Starfighter. This thing was legendary for a number of reasons, not all of them good. It was the first production fighter aircraft capable of sustaining speeds in excess of twice the speed of sound. Its speed and rate of climb were impressive even by today's standards, but that performance came at one hell of a price. This thing was known as the Widowmaker. If you weren't paying attention when you were flying one of these things, it would do its level best to kill you. Canada lost 46% of all of its F-104s due to accidents. One of these things almost managed to kill Chuck Yeager when he was pushing a world record attempt for altitude in an F-104. But if you were good enough to tame the Starfighter, it would perform for you. This was the first aircraft in the world to hold simultaneous official world records for speed, altitude, and time to climb. While we're on the subject of record holders, check this one out. This is the B-58 Hustler. It's the world's first operational supersonic bomber. It didn't actually carry any of its weapons internally. That huge pod underneath is actually where the bombs were contained, along with fuel, stores, and electronic equipment. B-58 Hustlers set 19 different world altitude and speed records and won 5 different aviation trophies. This particular B-58 set 3 of those records and won 2 of those trophies on the same day, on March the 5th, 1962, when it flew from Los Angeles to New York and back in record time. As a bomber, the B-58's effective service career pretty much ended when the Soviets developed the SA-2 high-altitude surface-to-air missiles. Flying high and fast was no longer an effective defense against the Soviet missile defense system. Just taking a quick pan around, right there in the middle, that's the F-106 Delta Dart, developed from the F-104 Delta Dagger. That thing actually fired nukes at other aircraft. The Air-2 Genie air-to-air nuclear missile. Seriously. Don't worry too much about the Blackbird. We will be taking a closer look at that at the moment. But for now, we're going to take a close look at the B-2 Spirit. All B-2 Spirits operate out of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, which means that a typical B-2 mission from Whiteman to a target anywhere in the world and all the way back can last well over 30 hours, with each aircraft capable of delivering up to 40,000 pounds of bombs. This particular B-2, the Spirit of Ohio, the only one on public display anywhere in the world, underwent extensive environmental testing early in its production, undergoing temperatures ranging from -65 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The technicians responsible for the testing painted this Fire and Ice logo on the nose landing gear panel and left their signatures for posterity. But this is the one that most of you have been waiting for. I get more people asking me to show them footage of the SR-71. The name Blackbird was completely unofficial. It was never officially known as the Blackbird, although it's easy to see where the name came from. But this aircraft, there's just something about it that seems to capture people's imagination. It had a 24-year-long career with the United States Air Force. First flew on the 22nd of December 1964 and first entered service in 1966. From 80,000 feet, this thing could survey 100,000 square miles of the Earth's surface per hour. On the 28th of July 1976, an SR-71 set 2 world records for its class, an absolute speed record of 2,193.167 miles per hour, and an absolute altitude record of 85,068.997 feet. Those 2 records have never been beaten. The standard response to having a missile fired at you when you were flying a Blackbird was just to open up the throttle and go a little bit faster. This thing just flew too high and too fast to ever be shot down. Taking a wander around the rest of the exhibits, we've got some iconic aircraft here. The McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle, the first US fighter with a thrust greater than the basic weight of the aircraft. This thing could accelerate in a vertical climb. The power generated by those 2 engines was absolutely unbelievable. Coming up on the left, a pair of McDonnell Douglas F4 Phantoms, but these are unusual versions of the F4 that we all know and love. The first one is the F4G Wild Weasel. This is the electronic warfare version. Its mission was to knock out enemy air defences. It would normally be equipped with the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile. This missile would lock onto enemy surface-to-air missile launcher radars. If the radars were switched off, it would go vertical, deploy a parachute, and just wait until the radars were switched on again, in which case it would reacquire the target and give it a nasty surprise. The next Phantom here is actually a reconnaissance version of the Phantom. It's the RF-4C Phantom II. This particular RF-4C has flown more hours and more missions than any other F4 variant ever. 173 missions and more than 7,300 hours of flight time. And oh look, it's a Lockheed AC130 Spectre gunship, which is basically just a Lockheed C-130 Hercules cargo aircraft, except with lots and lots and lots of big guns, some of which you can see displayed by the side of the aircraft. This particular AC-130, named Azrael, is a veteran of the Gulf War. On the 26th of February 1991, coalition ground forces were driving the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, and Azrael here was sent to the Al-Jarrah highway between Kuwait City and Basra to intercept the convoys of tanks, trucks, buses and cars that were fleeing the battle. It faced numerous enemy batteries of SA-6 and SA-8 surface-to-air missiles, as well as 37 and 57mm radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery. By the time that fight was over, the final score was Iraq 0, and Azrael here had given up counting. Tucked away behind Azrael, you could almost miss it, is this Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter. When I was serving on HMS Brazen in the first Gulf War, we actually detected one of these on radar. Although, to be fair to the Nighthawk pilot, what a lot of people don't realise is the whole stealth capability of aircraft like this isn't just the materials that they're made from and all the angles of the surface, but it's also the flight plan that you choose to fly against the radar stations that you're trying to defeat. And he obviously wasn't concerned about being picked up by us, so the fact that we detected him wasn't actually that much of an achievement. But hey, it made us feel special. And another aircraft that everybody goes nuts about, the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II with that monster 30mm Gatling gun. And let's not forget, it also carries another 16,000 pounds of ordnance alongside the gun. Very manoeuvrable at low speeds, which is just as well because low speeds were all the Thunderbolt can do. But it did carry the systems and the armour needed to survive at low speed and low altitude. The pilot's almost completely enclosed in a bathtub of solid titanium. It can fly on one engine, and with most of one of the wings shot off. And from one of the most butt-ugly aircraft in the world to two of the sexiest, the MiG-29 and the B-1 Lancer. Funny story about the MiG-29 actually. Well, it's not about the MiG-29, but it's about a pair of MiG-29 pilots that I was standing in a queue behind in order to get into a nightclub in Glasgow when I was in the Navy. They were there for an air show. The two pilots, out on the town in their uniforms, had no problem jumping to the front of the queue to get into the nightclub and getting straight in. Quick as a flash, we said, oh, we're their translators, and we followed them in for free as well. So, hooray for the Russian Air Force. And then, of course, you've got the B-1B Lancer supersonic bomber. Not to be confused with the B-1A Lancer, which was cancelled in 1977. It's just like a bigger, even sexier B-58 Hustler. Of course, this is the Cold War section of the US Air Force Museum, and one of the other things, besides flying aircraft, that the US Air Force was responsible for during the Cold War, and still today, was America's nuclear deterrent, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. The Space and Missile Gallery is actually quite a relatively new addition to the museum. Previously, these medium and intercontinental ballistic missiles were all just lying on their side in other areas of the museum, but this new gallery actually is designed to resemble the inside of a missile silo. And it's not all about raining down thermonuclear death and destruction on the Soviet Union. They do take pains to remind everybody that the development of these instruments of death and destruction did also have offshoots which were of benefit to humanity, such as the manned space program, putting satellites in orbit and putting men into space in the Gemini capsules. But the primary purpose was to rain down thermonuclear death and destruction on the Soviet Union. Well, that's it for my visit to the Korean and Cold War exhibits in the US Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. Coming up next, the final video in the series, we had a guided tour of the restoration hangar where they're working on some pretty iconic aircraft, such as the world-famous Memphis Belle B-17 bomber. All that to come in the next video. Take care out there, folks, and I'll catch you next time. Bonus clip, Gnome vs. Food, Space Age Edition. Bacon and eggs.